Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Looking forward to being joined soon by our new University of Texas comrades at SFA.
Oh.
I don't know if you've been following that, but that legislation is moving.
Oh, I have been following that, actually.
Add Stephen F. Austin to the UT system. So welcome, guys and gals, and everyone else.
Right. Enjoy the fund.
Enjoy the fun. So, as you can tell, happy to be joined today by Josh Blank, Research Director for the Texas Politics Project.
Hey, how's it
Top
going?
of the morning, Josh. It's still morning. It's after morning.
I think it's I guess it depends on where the top and the bottom of the morning is.
Right. Well, I think once you hit noon, it's in the way that 3 to 5 is afternoon. I guess afternoon is all afternoon.
Well, I guess,
right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to call this after morning.
I kind of like bottom of the morning, though.
Yeah, well.
That's me, anyway.
All right. So we're off to a good start here. No digressions here in this podcast.
No.
So last week, our theme was sort of abstract in the sense, although I think we did a good job of making it concrete, although we'll let the listeners decide
As
that.
concrete as we could.
Last week, our theme was uncertainty. And that general mood certainly continues this week as the Texas House and Senate both, continue to work pretty furiously. There's a lot of bills moving, a lot of committee hearings, et cetera. But, the sense of uncertainty, that we talked about last week, is still operative. The House and the Senate remain on different pages on, two of the key public issues that the governor and lieutenant governor have invested in heavily, property taxes and vouchers, ESAs. The Senate parental rights voucher bill has been referred to the House Education Committee. That's a fairly recent development. I think that happened yesterday. We're recording on Tuesday morning here. And there's tons of signaling still going on property tax relief and on most everything that the House and the Senate are disagreeing on. As we speak today on Tuesday again, lots of stuff going on today in the kind of, outside of those big focus issues. Hearings today on guns, on water, lots of other things. So,
local control or not.
Yeah, the Burroughs preemption bill, I believe, is moving today. So, a lot going on. Rather than pick one of those things, we're going to let things ripen a little bit more, I think, although, some of these things will come up, no doubt. But speaking of all the signaling going on, Josh, you took some time over the last week or so to look at some of the data that we collected in our last two polls in December and February on Texas attitudes towards media. And we did this in a couple of different bites. So in December, we looked at Texans' sort of media habits in consuming political news, and I'll let you unpack that in a minute. And then in February, we asked about use of social media, both what people seem to be reported using and favorable ratings towards the different platforms for, reasons that we can talk about. And I think a lot of ways the timing was good for both of those batteries. I mean, there's always a lot of interest in media use. I mean, we've over the years of doing this poll, we've relatively intermittently checked in on this. But, in the first years of the poll, there was another Texas media poll going on at UT that's since, I guess, kind of gone into abeyance or ended or whatever exactly is going on there. Mm-hmm. And so we did kind of stay away from it from the first several years because somebody else was doing it.
Well, I'd also add, brass tacks. Media use questions take up a lot of survey space.
Right. And as we'll kind of illustrate here with the data you'll talk about. But nonetheless, I mean, even in the immediate say last year or two, if not more immediate in some ways. We're continuing to see a lot of interesting developments in what we think of as, the traditional media space. I mean, all you have to do is look at the headlines. Fox News has been, in the news with the revelations that have come out as part of the defamation lawsuit by Dominion Voting Systems. That trial is supposed to happen this week, though there are obviously negotiations going on. Something of a disruption in the pattern of cable news that we used to sort of think of as defining the cable news space and kind of, interesting in the early 2000s. Fox has more competition on the right with multiple outlets that proliferated, particularly during the Trump presidency and the immediate aftermath. CNN's been moved by management away from the tone it adopted during the Trump presidency, which was read by many as being kind of reflexively oppositional to Trump and frankly to Republicans. And I think there's actually some truth in that if you watch CNN much. And then overall within that space, cable news viewership I think is pretty stagnant more or less. In the longer term, we've seen, local television has been changing. I mean, I think for a long time the story was and still remains the paucity of local news. And you and I have talked about this maybe even on the podcast before. I think two things about that. On one hand, sure, the decline in the reach of local newspapers was a pretty demonstrable fact. I think local television is more complicated in the sense that, even talking to journalists, it's often been considered kind of the ugly stepchild of the news environment. And yet there have been interesting things going on there with the consolidation of these big local ownership changes that now exist. It used to be you had a local network affiliate.
Right.
That's kind of, what you needed to know. But now there's this whole other cross, ownership factor of these big conglomerates that have been consolidating local news markets over the last decade or so.
Right.
In Austin, the recognizable brands or even, Texas writ large, Nexstar, Sinclair,
Right.
Gray Television, though not as big in Texas. Companies like that. Social media environment, also pretty dynamic. Right. And this is where there's a real, we could look at the longer term, but certainly in the short term, if you think about how, Fox News has been in the news.
Right.
Twitter, the Elon Musk purchase of Twitter has put Twitter relentlessly, probably only intermittently in the national news, but certainly in sort of our circles.
Well, Elon Musk, who did an interview on Fox News last night.
Right. Musk is just, there's so many different things going on with him, but Twitter is certainly the thing that, in this space, his purchase of Twitter has been a real earthquake, I think. And his seeming reshaping of Twitter according to, what do you want to call it? Dispositions, impulses, political whims, neuroses. I don't know. The massive burst of attention to TikTok, first because of its rapid use, and it's, the explosion in use, sort of a spoiler alert here, by young people, but also just the general. I mean, the user base of TikTok is huge, international. Fold into that the issue of Chinese ownership stake. Very much in the news. And that all comes, in the wake of, you were saying before the podcast, the kind of, the attention to Facebook, its handling of the 2016 election, but even before that.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's handling of
questions
user
about
data
Facebook's
generally.
algorithm and, whether Facebook was doing harm or good, to the polity, et cetera. So there was a lot going on that kind of drove us to ask some questions about these things. So let's unpack some of what you found as you were once you took time to process these batteries. And there's an interesting kind of insight in terms of our, we kind of did these, they were interesting, took us a while to get back to them, right?
Yeah, well, it's one of those things where, we didn't want to wait too long, but also, ultimately, like, it's sort of something that just keeps coming up, right?
Yeah.
And so it's definitely worth checking in on. I mean, one of the interesting things I'll just sort of start off with, and then we're not really going to talk about again, is in this long list of sort of media sources for news. If you're listening to this right now, you're part of the 15% of Texas voters who say that they listen to podcasts as one of their sources of political news. But I think that's really important here. I think like one of the things that I think happens a lot just in politics generally is that the people who pay attention to politics seem to have some really kind of interesting sort of underinformed or motivated ideas about what the rest of the public is doing, thinking,
Right.
how they're approaching things.
What they know, what they don't.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so what's I think kind of just on its face, I mean, what's useful about something like this is just to take a step back and say, okay, let's update our assumptions a little bit about how the electorate is engaging with political news and media. And then further, there's this other piece to it, which is, a little bit more complicated. And I didn't go too deep into this, but, how do like usage patterns and, overall views relate? Because ultimately, I think at this point, what's kind of become apparent, I think, in the recent era more, I mean, I don't know, it's like more prevalent is this idea of sort of like reluctant usage. I mean, you hear it a lot from a lot of people where they say like, oh yeah, I hate Twitter. And it's like, are you on Twitter? Yeah, I'm on Twitter.
Yeah.
You
That's
know?
how I know I hate it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people
And
who
I can't get enough.
and you hear a lot of people talking about like, oh, I'm going to get off this platform or that, and some people do,
Yeah.
and some people don't. And so I think this was a really interesting time to kind of ask this set of questions. So let's start off at 30,000 feet, right? I mean, you were talking about local television consolidation, and in some ways, local television being something of I guess I shouldn't say, I'll just
already
say.
said it, but-
Did you say redhead stepchild? Or
I
just
think I said ugly stepchild.
Oh, ugly stepchild. Okay, well, let's just leave that alone. The stepchild of the media environment. But the thing is, and this is something that we found consistently, we've been finding this over time, local television stations remain one of the primary sources of news for most Texans. So 43% of Texas voters said that they used local television in the previous week to find, basically news about politics. But interestingly, and this is something that we definitely would not have found 5 or 10 years ago, it was tied in basically its overall saturation with social media like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, where 42% of Texans said that.
Social media writ large,
Writ
is how
large.
we offered that as an option at that level, and that was the December poll.
Yeah, and that was in the December poll. And that's where we're, if you think about, and I'll just tell you can look this up later. We'll put it on the blog post when we put this up. But when you look at news sources here, we're talking really about, like local news broadcasts, national news broadcasts, talking about, national newspapers like the New York Times and their websites, but also local newspapers, the Austin American Statesman, the Dallas News and their morning news and their websites. And we're really trying to break this out. Podcasts, conservative news websites, liberal news websites, really trying to get a sense of where people are getting their
Right.
news. And again, the main source for most people is still going to be local news. And that sort of raises, again, this sort of issue, again, about, the importance of local media, honestly, in a lot of cases, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things about that is that, we've gotten it before. I mean, I can't remember exactly when the last time we did a similar battery was, but this is not the first time that this has shown up. And we've seen it in
Other
national
sources,
polls.
yeah.
It's reasonably well known, I guess, as a fact. But it's interesting to me the degree to which this has, already for a while been incorporated into campaign strategy.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And certainly, I mean, and I do think that the, Republican campaigns in Texas have been, the Abbott campaign in particular has really made a point of saying, if we can go out and hit local newscasts, particularly in areas that are kind of outside or on the edge of them, outside of the major media markets, it's a form of targeting. I mean, we talk a lot about targeting on social media, but ultimately it's a traditional it's a way of targeting your audiences, but using traditional media.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so remarkable living in Austin and Travis County, which is not a very competitive political environment. In some ways, how few political ads you actually see around campaign season if you just take a minute and like drive outside of Austin, go
Right.
Almost anywhere else, and the local television stations at night are just bombarded with these ads.
Listen to AM radio.
Yeah, right, for sure. So, when we look at the social media item, which we asked, we went into more detail. So again, in the December poll, we asked just about, broad buckets of different sort of sources of media. In the February poll, we want to ask specifically about different social media platforms, both whether people have used them. And here we extended the time frame in the last month. And then further, we said, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of each of these? And so we're trying to get a sense, again, given sort of all these undercurrents that you were bringing up at the beginning, what people's reactions are to these different social media companies. And this is something, to me, as a public opinion scholar or study or research or whatever you want to call it, this is super interesting because what I say is when I don't really know like how the numbers are going to fall.
Yeah, that was nice about this, I thought, in that,
It's just sort of, you say like, I mean, going into this, hey, what do you think, the fave unfave numbers on Twitter are going to be? It's like, I don't know,
Right.
which is why I was good to ask. So again, taking a step back, only 2 social media platforms, I think we tested about 11 or so, maybe 10, attracted a majority of users from the Texas electorate. So that was YouTube, which will kind of put a pin in as to whether that's a social media platform or not. I say yes. Their CEO says no. He has different interests than I do. but anyway,
You think?
so 84% of Texans, and more than 4 in 5 said they used YouTube in the last month, and 77% said they had used Facebook. Now, I know a lot of people might say, wait, isn't Facebook on the way out if you kind of like, follow? But the thing is not in the electorate because the electorate is older. Right. And so that's something to consider here, and we'll kind of come back to as we go into some of the groups. But Facebook remains, just one of the most sort of widespread social media applications across the electorate. I thought this was sort of interesting when you think about sort of like different kinds of social media platforms, and just some gender differences were interesting here in the electorate. Men were more likely to say that they'd used Twitter in the last month, which was 51% compared to 39%. It's a pretty good gap.
That's one of those things where I wonder if that's changed. What I kind of doubt it, but I don't know.
I don't want to. This is where we get to sort of engage in some speculation. But I think when you look across the various sort of social media platforms, if you think about like, is this a platform where you yell, or is this a platform where you post? I think you could start to kind of use that as a rationale.
Are you generalizing, saying men are yellers?
Well, it looks like it, at least in terms of which ones they like to use.
There's an old yeller joke in there somewhere I can't quite reach.
So, and women were about like 10 points more likely to say they use Facebook and Instagram compared to men.
Right.
Okay. So obviously,
and we should say, that is consistent also with some of the thing, over, and again, pre-Musk that, the sort of sexism and bullying and stuff on Twitter.
Right. Anyway, there's lots of hypotheses we could generate
there's
here.
A lot of things here, yeah.
So, I think, obviously here, what we're really interested in, given where we're sitting, is sort of the partisan patterns in political information consumption, right? Because that's really, I think, what people have been talking about for a long time, and kind of what we wanted to see. One, is that evidence in the data? And then if so, like how, right? And where?
Right. And it's funny because you go into this with, some assumptions, predispositions, as much as we're trying to be objective. And it's interesting to hear what's confirmatory and what's not.
Yeah,
right?
For sure. There's a lot more nuance here than I think, I would have thought when we asked the questions. And I'll just sort of preview it anyway, because there's no point, and this is going to be true in general. One, age is a big factor here. No surprise, right? But, having said that, you don't necessarily think about the impact of age, let's say, on Republican consumption habits when people talk about like Republican consumption of the news. Well, there's actually some pretty big variability both in terms of age and gender when we look at GOP attitudes towards the media. And there's also, similar but slightly different kind of, impacts among Democrats. And so, when you start to describe like, the Republican media ecosystem, it turns out that I don't know exactly what that means, having looked at this. So let's just get into it and then we can kind of come back.
Yeah.
Okay. So the most prevalent source of news for Republicans in Texas is still local television, not surprisingly. Now for them, almost identical share still says cable television news in their websites. So it's 44% for local television, 42% for cable television, and then social media comes in third at 37%. So one, it's important to note, social media is pretty widespread in its, again, as a source for news. And in some ways this is somewhat confirmatory. Local television is a news source for everybody, but also among Republicans, cable television news is still a primary source. But then you start to see like, well, what if we dig into that a little bit more? And it was interesting, right? Number one, I thought this was very interesting. Republican men appear to be significantly more likely than Republican women to get their news from what we might think of as traditionally conservative sources of news, like cable television, 50% of men compared to 35% of women, of Republican women, conservative news websites, 36% of men compared to 23% of women, and talk radio, 30% of Republican men compared to 23% of Republican women. But yet, nearly equal shares say that they get their information from local television and from social media. So it's these, sort of, again, when we think about the traditional sort of, historically conservative, media ecosystem, especially like talk radio, these conservative news websites, this is really much more, again, a source of news for Republican men than women, which I think is pretty interesting. It's not leading to very divergent views.
Right. We're often, looking for, to see if there are differences between Republican men and women. And, this is a little too general, but it seems to me more often than not, those gaps are not as big as we expect.
Yeah, and the thing that's interesting about this actually is normally when we see gender gaps that can be explained by partisanship, so often what we find is that, Democratic identification runs higher among women than it does among men, or vice versa. You can say
Right.
Republican. It doesn't matter how you put it, but there's a gap there. And so often when we see gender gaps, what we're really talking about is partisan gaps, not gender gaps.
Right.
But in this case, we're just looking at Republicans. So these actually are just gender gaps within the party, and they're pretty wide. So I mean, it's just sort of an interesting finding about, the media ecosystem, especially among Republicans. And already by gender, if you're trying to reach out to Republican men, there's some big targets out there that aren't necessarily as big for Republican women.
Yeah.
Now, looking on a little further, looking at the social, reactions to social media, YouTube was the only social media platform, as we'll call it, viewed favorably by a majority of Republicans. And there it was only 53% who said they had a favorable opinion of YouTube. No more than 36% of Republicans said that they held a positive view of any of the other social media platforms tested. This included Facebook, this included Twitter, Snapchat, LinkedIn. It also included Truth Social, Parler. So, I mean, we were trying to get a pretty good spread here. And ultimately, what you find is that in general, it's not, I mean, one thing you might take away from this, I think, is that it's not even so much that Republicans have a problem with TikTok. It's that as a group, Republicans have a problem with all of it.
Yeah, which is, I've been mulling that, and I'm still not quite sure what to make of it. I'm wondering if there's a little bit of a, dynamic here that's akin to antipathy towards negative ads.
Interesting. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is, people say they hate it, but they use it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was thinking,
kind of thing, and I don't, and the use data doesn't necessarily ground that, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think once we go through the Democratic views, it'll be interesting to come
Yeah.
back to this question, because I'll just add two things we can come back to. I mean, one, I think of like whatever is the inverse of like a halo effect. I mean, it's almost like because there's this sort of negative attitudes towards some social media, and that's really prevalent, and because use is not that high, especially among older Republicans, then all of a sudden does that imbue sort of a negative response to everything? And then I'd also say generally, regardless of what party you're a part of, there's also just sort of a central body of evidence and information that's kind of going out, I think, increasingly that says, hey, this isn't good for kids. Any of it. Like, none of it is good for anybody.
Oh, that's an interesting, yeah.
And I think that's sort of, in this sort of environment we're in right now where we're talking about what kids are exposed to a lot as a major sort of political ploy, it is interesting that at the same time, there's a lot of studies that kind of have been coming out saying, really social media of any kind is not really good for like a teenager.
Right.
And so, I mean, I don't know, but I'll just sort of throw that out there. Yeah. But I'll tell you
we'll
what.
Put a pin in that. Yeah.
Well, but I'll tell you what. Ultimately, Republican voters who are under 30 and to a lesser extent, maybe under 45, hold much more favorable views in general than do older Republicans. So, for example, as much as TikTok has been in the news as sort of an object of scorn, and especially among Republicans.
Suspicion, danger.
Whatever word you want to use, a majority of Republican voters under 30, 52%, said that they held a favorable view of TikTok, but no more than a quarter of any of the older cohorts among Republicans, right? And so, again, that's sort of one of those, not surprising, but the gap is interesting, and we've seen this before. I think in the Republican electorate where there do tend to be differences when we look at the youngest cohort of Republicans who are the older on things like climate change.
Right.
On some
little
of these
pockets of
just honestly, the time, right? I mean, everybody comes of age at a different point of time, and ultimately, these Republican voters are still young people, and they're young people before they're Republicans. And ultimately, if they're engaging with, a platform that their peers are engaging with regularly, and this is the way that they, do whatever, express, I mean, like,
it's going to be hard for their Republicanness to outweigh that.
Be like, what?
In a lot of cases.
Yeah, I mean, I just think, think about when you were 23 and whether you were thinking more about, like, your presence in front of, let's say, probably physical objects of desire on the one hand, and on the other hand, you're concerned about a growingly powerful China.
Right.
I don't know. I think I most of us probably cared about the
or
former.
the cognitive impact it may have had on you as you were growing up or something.
Yeah.
Right.
All right.
Feels fine to me.
Yeah. Well, exactly. So, okay. So Democratic media use and views. Let's talk about that, and we can kind of come back around. So, across the board, Texas's Democratic voters showed a greater variety in their media consumption habits than did Texas's Republicans. So social media and local news were a source for 50%. Of Democrats, but also almost a majority, 44%, said they looked at broadcast television news and their websites for information. 41% said cable news, in their respective websites. A third still said national newspapers in their websites, and even a third said local newspapers in their websites. So, there's just tends to be a little bit, I wouldn't even say that Democrats are out necessarily consuming more news, but there seems to be less resistance to a lot of the traditional sources of news that are out there, which makes a lot of sense given, the conversations that have gone on. A majority of Democratic voters said that they'd used 4 social media applications as a source for news in the previous month in our February poll. Twitter was 50%, Instagram was 56%, Facebook was 78%, and YouTube was 88%. So just in general, if you think about like the different, you're talking about Republicans really leaning on local news, and local news broadcast is a good place to reach voters, especially outside of major cities. You can see why, when you hear about Democratic investments in campaigns, there's so much of it is about digital advertising, digital targets,
Right.
because, ultimately it's going to hit a lot of
That's where
Democratic voters.
Yeah.
Okay. Having said all this, Democrats hold only a slightly more positive view of social media platforms than the overall electorate. 3/4 hold a positive view of YouTube, which is really the outlier in a lot of ways,
Right.
for I think reasons we could talk about or not. But 45% hold a positive view of Facebook, which sounds about right. 44% of Instagram. But again, like Republicans, fewer than about 36%. So fewer than 36%, a little more than a third, hold a positive view of any of the other platforms. Now, some of that is people just not holding a view at all, and that's important to say. But in general, it's not like there's widespread positive feeling out there about much of the social media landscape, I think, as we see it right now, right?
Right.
And then the last bit from this, before we kind of go into some takeaways, is, the sort of is the independents, right? So the not Democrats and the non-Republicans, the people who don't identify with either party initially
lean.
or when pushed even. And
Yeah.
the way that we define this was in the news a little bit this week because Gallup released some new data, as they often do, with kind of very, very blithely about it.
Yeah.
About
I saw that. I saw the point. I saw the data, and I saw the thread you
I
reposted on Twitter.
posted a thread on Twitter. So Gallup released this data this week, basically talking about the growing share of political independence. The definition of political independence is something that political scientists talk about a lot. A really noted pollster, Charles Franklin, had basically put up a Twitter thread sort of responding to this, kind of how we might think about this. All very interesting. When we're talking about political independence here,
Right.
we're talking about the approximately 10 to 15% of voters who don't identify with either party initially, and when pushed, do not identify with either party. Right. These are the people who remain. The main thing to know about political independence and media consumption is that they consume less media than do partisans, for the most part. There's a couple of instances where they may, consume a little bit more of other types of media, but ultimately no more than 31% said that they consumed any of the 14 sources of media that we tested for news in the previous week, right? So no more than a third. This is honestly, this is surprising to people, but just, this is a sort of, I think, a foundational characteristic of independence, which is often they're not going to be as engaged with politics as partisans, right? And some of that, you can think about where the causal arrows go on that, which directions they're going, but it should make a fair amount of sense that, if you pay a bunch of attention to politics, it's odds are you'll pick a side at some point.
Right.
And if you don't, it's kind of easier just not to.
Yeah. I've always thought that there's an interesting idealization at work in both the subjective sort of declaration of being of political independence and the outside assumptions. And, people, I think confuse being politically independent with being, an active independent thinker.
Right. Well, some people,
And some are.
yeah, some are, or think they are. Or
But as this shows, there's not a lot of engagement. I've been kind of thinking about, since, you put all this together and, in fits and starts since we looked at this,
yeah.
I'm trying to figure out, what I think about this difference between, Democratic and Republican habits here.
Mm-hmm.
And what they're, how they express it. Because on one hand, some of it fits our preconceived notions of the parties, right?
Yeah.
What do you know? Democrats are, kind of more eclectic in their media sources, a little, spread out a little bit more,
Yeah.
In some ways that looks not unlike the most important problem, batteries.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to,
In that, in a sense, right? A little more active, a little less monotonic,
Yeah.
In some ways. I'm not sure what the explanation for that is in terms of media habits among Republicans, though.
yeah. I think,
There's a lot more digging in. I haven't looked much at this like by intensity, and I think that would be interesting.
no, but I think, part of what is sort of, I mean, there's the part of
the
it.
independent thing makes a lot of sense. But
Yeah, I mean, I think there's part of it that's, I think pretty explainable, and some of that is just in the different demographics of the parties.
well,
right?
I was going to say,
You were kind of, you're waving at that there a little bit. I'll just say it
Right.
explicitly. I mean, I think that the fact that the Democratic Party tends to skew younger.
say
It
age
tends-
and heterogeneity.
It tends to skew, with more, racial and ethnic diversity, which is going to impact media and social media use, I think. Not to mention the fact that I also think there's a certain, potential, I would say, less threat, in terms of the values and sort of ideology of Democrats, of sort of these technological platforms as they've been deployed.
Right.
I think for the most part, I'm going to say, we're kind of at a point, as you raised at the beginning, where, that's kind of,
Yeah.
that's shifting a little bit. I mean, to the extent that I think it's notable that there was this idea, whether true or not, that conservatives needed their own social media applications to be able to express themselves. I don't get the impression that Democrats or liberals have felt that they, are limited in their ability to express themselves on the existing offerings.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of reasons, I think you can see that. Having said that, there's also kind of just interesting differences within the parties that were really kind of the most surprising to me. I think having, grown up during the cable news, revolution and this idea of, cable news being this big behemoth, it's really interesting to look at this data and realize, one, it's not a behemoth. It's not even that, cable news isn't a behemoth. It's not even a behemoth within sort of the Republican ecosystem. And I think that's kind of what was one of the more surprising
Right.
results here is that, everybody knows that Fox News has competition now. Got it. But to really sort of put on paper the fact that, okay, but social media and cable news are basically, and local news are all kind of at an equal level of saturation within the Republican Party. But also, once we dig into that, it's is that going to be the same across the Republican Party? The answer is clearly not, right? And when we look at use patterns, social media use patterns, amongst Republicans under 30, and in some cases under 45, compared to older Republicans who really are, the core of the party is usually, an older, whiter base. Those are two different media universes. I mean,
Well, it's funny you would say that because I was kind of wondering also, though, about what the connective, there's also connective tissue between those that,
well,
I mean, the use, calling it a media ecosystem is actually helps.
yeah,
In other words, if you watch just random, if you watch Fox, but you're not on Twitter,
right.
that doesn't mean that, you're not,
Yeah.
the people on Twitter aren't being fed by Fox and the people on Fox aren't being fed by Twitter.
No, absolutely. And it's not like you're getting
Which
necessarily.
we've been seeing in spades.
Yeah, you're not.
recently.
I mean, I think that's a really important point. You're not getting different messages
Right.
per se. I mean, you may be getting sort of different levels of intensity, right?
Yeah, it would be interesting as we, if we were to take the time to parse this out more, we'd have to probably replicate it a little bit more. But, to see if there are detectable clusters within some of these pockets.
Well, you're raising, part of the issue too about why these media consumption questions actually why we don't do it too much. I mean, and it's not because we don't want to do the work. It's because this is a really interesting, actually 3 different batteries that we ran over 2 surveys that each took up a fair amount of space on
Right.
its own, and we're not even really asking about frequency, how often are you using this, right?
Yeah.
Versus something else. So that's one
We
of
got a
the
very rough measure of
This
this
is a-
last month.
Yeah, it's definitely a rough measure, but I mean, I still think, given the way, my big takeaway for the Republican piece of this is that I think, the Republican, sort of media consumption habits are often talked about in a very sort of fixed, homogenous kind of
Right.
way.
Look.
Similar to the
again,
way we talk about the party.
Right. To be fair to Republicans, it's a common Democratic trope that this obviously portrays as much more complicated that, Fox gives marching orders and Republicans march.
Which is, and this data would say that's just silly.
Right. It's silly. And, as we've seen on, we referenced this, I referenced this briefly earlier, as we've seen some of the discovery in the Dominion case, it's like that, we talk about it all the time in terms of political leadership, elites, and public opinion. There's a variation on that is that, that's a dance.
Yeah.
And sometimes public opinion is kind of leading.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's sort of the takeaway. I think the question that raises going forward is, given that there seems to be this clear dividing line between younger Republicans and older Republicans and kind of in their orientation towards media, because, again, younger Republicans are just people living their lives first, right? And their media consumption habits are going to be driven by more than just where they get political news. It does make sort of this, very aggressive posture towards, social media and new media formats. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out kind of over a couple, whether election cycles or legislative cycles or what have you.
Well, and also I think, and then attendant to that on this, how that's going to interact with, big unknowns in the social media universe right now. Look, we're facing this ourselves as we think about our propagation strategies and distribution strategies. I could spin out a couple of hypotheses I might defend, and I know you can and have, but I don't know what's going to happen with Twitter.
Oh, no way.
Right. Or, whether any of these other sort of contending platforms or established platforms that are looking to, exploit this. I don't think there's, what this underlines in part is that for most voters, at least in terms of their direct habit, doesn't matter.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Right, this is kind of our
well,
problem.
Honestly, for the most reliable voters, it really doesn't matter.
And it doesn't matter, and it doesn't matter in their, now, it doesn't matter in terms of their activities or what they're doing or, their kind of habits. But I think the earlier point I was trying to make is also kind of relevant here is that, it may matter in a more structural way.
Yeah.
In the sense that, look, a lot of reporting and promotion and campaigning tactics, incorporate Twitter and incorporate social media.
Yeah.
And, there's an interest, I think the signs of all the tremors and all that we've seen, are kind of present here when you look at a lot of the patterns that you've talked about here. One of the surprising things that I think flew in the face of conventional wisdom a little bit was sort of age in Facebook. Right?
Yeah.
Because I think the conventional wisdom is, Facebook is where, my parents or my grandparents go to do social media.
Right.
Now, there's some degree of support for that in this, but not in some huge way. Right.
No, well, because the truth is, the younger people are still using Facebook more than the older people because they're using all social media more than the older people. So there's an aspect of this. It's like, yes, relative to the other options, sure, there are more old people here. But the reality is there aren't as many old people on any of these, platforms as are younger people because, again, it wasn't, it wasn't made for them. It wasn't made
again by older, we 65 plus. Because that middle-aged older cohort is,
yeah, I would
follows
say
that as well.
The dividing line I'm using here, and this is without any judgment at all on actual age. I'm just saying older and younger because there's two categories. 45.
Yeah.
When we look at Republicans, just in general, there's just more use of all social media platforms among the younger cohorts. It just so happens that Facebook, early market entrant, all kinds of things is, maintained a certain, pride of place amongst even the older cohorts. But still, that doesn't mean that a majority of Republicans over 45 are using Facebook.
Right. And so I think, as we wind it up, one thing for people that probably listen, they're likely to be hearing this, one of the interesting elements here is, the world that we see in terms of, and we've known this, but I think this underlines it. The world you see, especially on Twitter right now, in terms of the text ledge feed, look, interesting, tells you some stuff about some people and about, and we have an okay sense of who those people are, but not very indicative of what's going on out there. Not the world that most people are seeing if they're looking at political news.
Do you know what's worse than no survey at all? Would be like a Twitter poll.
Oh, I'm glad we got a chance to put that
I just
in
want
there.
to throw that out there.
Yes.
Just in terms,
in case you've wondered why we hate Twitter polls.
But it's a good example. It's not a representative sample. Before we finish up, I want to talk about the Democrats a little bit.
Yeah,
I think this is, one other sort of interesting thing, and I didn't really put this in the blog post that where we kind of put all this data together on the website. But I thought it was interesting. You can kind of look at this data yourself. Democratic millennials were an interesting group in this. Now, I want to put a caveat on this, which is to say, we're talking about a subset of less than half the sample, right? Because we're talking about, basically 30 to 44-year-old Democratic identifiers out of a poll of 1,200. So one, I want to say there's going to be an error bar around these results.
A pretty substantial one, yeah.
And two, we've done this once. So I want to say, I want to do this again before I go too deep into this. But one of the other sort of interesting pieces of this was how consistently less positive, or if you want to say negative, whatever, and those are different things, but yeah, I'm just saying either one, Democratic millennials were towards a lot of media and social media. Yeah. I thought that was kind of interesting, being a millennial myself, and just sort of thinking about, because this is the group that sort of was, the definition of this group is based around social media. Yeah. Essentially, in the start of social media, and this is the group that actually, among Democrats, was more likely to since have a negative or less positive view of most social media platforms. Where even the older groups were like, no, these platforms are fine, or I have a favorable view. And again, the group in particular, millennials, were just showing a little bit of reticence. Now, whether that goes back to Facebook, sort of the 2016 election, how Facebook had sort of, Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter and his sort of transformation of it. Right. And again, to the whole point, is this about something specific? Is it more general? But that's also something that's kind of interesting to keep an eye on, in the sense that, is that sort of an ascendant group in Democratic politics? The idea that this group has sort of different communication preferences relative to the rest of the party is kind of an interesting sort of donut hole in the data that,
and it does, it's an interesting spin, again, with all the caveats you've mentioned. It's an interesting spin on what we think of as the perpetual difficulty mobilizing young Democratic voters.
Yeah, that's a really good way to, yeah, no, for sure. I hadn't thought about that, but that's,
maybe because, you're in a hole to begin with when you're using all these channels you think are great for reaching millennials.
Well, and that's I think, if anyone is going to take anything away from this podcast, this piece, whatever, it's that, anyone who says like, well, if you want to reach fill in the blank X, you got to be on whatever. It's like, take a look at the data.
Yeah.
It's one snapshot, but I think, it's a lot more complicated than that in most cases. And, again, I think like what's interesting, on the one hand, you've got, Republicans who are actually sort of, kind of trying to kneecap, what is a major communication platform to reaching lots of their voters, or a series of them generally, depending on how the things play out. And then on the Democratic side, you have another one of these issues where it's kind of like, well, which social media platform,
And clearly, I think you're right about that. So that's a smart thing to pull out of this. There's no silver bullet there.
No, not at all.
Right. And, which again, reminds me of the traditional Democratic dilemmas, right? One more aspect of that.
Right.
Well, thanks for all the work you did putting that together and explaining this to people. We will link to that post in the post for this podcast on our website. If you're getting this at another outlet, or you're going to direct to another social media /podcast outlet, you'll find us at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. There's a section on the front page for polling. Follow it through the blog, and you will find the post that Josh did, and lots of links to all the data we've talked about. So with that, thanks again to Josh for being here and doing all that work. Thanks again to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. Keep an eye on the legislature. It's getting, very wild over there.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.